innovation blocker, tech stagnation mechanics. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the workshops that should have powered a turnaround. The Soviet Union could reverse engineer almost anything. It struggled to invent the next thing, not because engineers weren't talented, they were, but because the system they worked in strangled feedback and starved risk. Start with the rewards. A factory director's safest path was to meet the plan with yesterday's design. Changing a product meant halting a line, missing targets, and inviting punishment. Even approved innovations carried penalties. A new model's teething problems could tank monthly fulfillment, so managers delayed adoption until the end of a reporting period or faked upgrades by adding weight or cosmetic features that didn't compromise throughput. Innovation became an accounting hazard. Then there were the inputs. Modern electronics, machine tools, and precision bearings were exactly the items COCOM controls restricted. After the Toshiba Kongsberg scandal mid-1980s, when Western firms were caught selling restricted milling and propeller technology that aided Soviet submarine quieting, the pipeline narrowed further. Legal channels delivered older vintages. Illegal channels were costly and unreliable. Ministries built shadow projects to replicate Western kit, but without market feedback and with procurement driven by quotas, clones lagged years behind. The military sector could hoard scarce components. Civilian sectors made do with substitutes. The gap widened. Inside design bureaus, brilliance met bureaucracy. A team in Zelenograd could architect a microchip family. Getting it into mass production meant negotiating with ministries that allocated clean rooms, chemicals, and test equipment by plan, not by potential. If a bureau won the allocation, it then faced another barrier. Enterprise directors reluctant to retool lines for a component that might fail to arrive in volume. Meanwhile, black markets paid engineers for moonlighting, draining time from state projects. The incentives were coherent for individuals and disastrous for innovation. What nobody knew at the time, outside a few circles, was how much the measurement problem fed this stagnation. The plan rewarded gross indicators, units shipped, tons produced. Quality metrics were crude, often gamed, and rarely tied to user satisfaction. A consumer electronics plant could hit targets by producing televisions with high failure rates so long as the count was right. Service networks, underfunded and under-incentivized, couldn't create the feedback loops that drive iterative improvement. The result was a culture of one-off launches and chronic underperformance. The defense complex was a paradox. It produced world-class rockets and respectable avionics in silos of excellence. But those islands didn't become archipelagos. The spillover into civilian life was limited because secrecy, compartmentalization, and classification walls blocked diffusion. A guidance system algorithm might exist in a closed city. The civilian computer industry couldn't access the people, let alone the code. When it did, production-scale constraints and component shortages wasted the insight. The state could command a moonshot. It couldn't mass-produce a reliable washing machine with the same discipline. There was also the matter of finance. Enterprises didn't go bankrupt for failing to meet consumer demand. They received soft budget constraints and subsidies. Banks didn't allocate capital based on expected returns. They executed planned directives. Price signals that tell innovators where value lies were muffled. A director who took a leap on a new process risked planned failure. A director who stuck with the known risked nothing. The calculus was rational survival. The aggregate was stasis. Meanwhile, global technology sprinted ahead. Japan perfected just-in-time manufacturing and high-precision machine tools. The West integrated microprocessors into everything. The USSR tried to copy, but copying requires more than blueprints. It requires complementary ecosystems. Suppliers who can deliver to spec, distributors who can respond to demand shifts, service networks that feed information back to designer. The command system's siloed ministries blocked these horizontal connections. Managers bargained vertically with their supervising ministry. They did not build lateral relationships with suppliers and customers beyond what the plan prescribed. The emergent complexity that sparks innovation was planned out of existence. 3 days earlier, something strange occurred in a Minsk tractor plant. An engineer proposed a redesign that would cut fuel consumption by 5%. The math was solid, the parts were available. The director paused. The current model met quotas and used established supply lines. Switching would require retraining, a temporary shutdown, and the risk of teething failures. The director filed the idea under next year and shipped the old tractor. 5% fuel savings vanished into the queue, multiplied across thousands of machines. Unknown to them, across town, a consumer electronics shop manager kept a notebook of returns. A batch from one factory failed at triple the usual rate. He sent a report up the chain. Months later, the factory received a reprimand, not a resource allocation to fix the line. The manager learned a lesson. Documenting failure brought attention, not help. He stopped counting. The feedback loop died. The 1987 law on state enterprise tried to loosen the grip. More autonomy, limited self-financing. But autonomy without markets mostly meant directors negotiated harder with ministries while still chasing quotas. Profit as a metric drifted in a sea of distorted prices. When prices on inputs were fixed and outputs were subsidized, internal profit told you more about a ministry's transfer than about value creation. Managers learned to seek favorable plan assignments and price ratios, not customers. This was the moment everything changed from slowdown to sclerosis. As oil dollars dried up and imports faltered, the system had to rely on domestic innovation to stretch scarce inputs. That required flexibility, fast feedback, and risk-taking. Instead, the incentive grid pushed in the opposite direction. The best minds solved constrained problems in defense. The rest solved bureaucratic problems in production. The machine that once caught up by copying found it couldn't even copy fast enough. In the aftermath, the country looked at its shelves and its machines and realized something brutal. Talent wasn't the issue. Permission was. And by the time permission came, in halting reforms and half-open markets, the cash was gone, the patience was gone, and the world had moved on. Glasnost Perestroika. Opening reveals the gap. The first shock wasn't a riot. It was a statistic read aloud on television. Under Glasnost, mid to late 1980s, numbers long buried in annexes started slipping into speeches. Managers who'd spent careers reporting fulfillment heard a new phrase, hidden inflation. Prices hadn't moved on paper, but shortages were doing the job for them. Perestroika promised acceleration, yet the first thing it accelerated was honesty. To understand why the reveal hit like a blow, remember what the model hid. For years, defense and heavy industry consumed the best metal, the best mines, the best machine time. Now, in reform meetings, economists showed charts. Civilian machinery was decades old. Consumer goods were stuck in designs no one wanted. The country had built a fortress and discovered the pantry was bare. When a senior official acknowledged that defense absorbed an extraordinary share of national output, the room went quiet. Nobody said the number in public. They didn't have to. People felt it in the empty shops. Perestroika tried to change how decisions were made. The 1987 law on state enterprise told directors they could set plans from below, keep more of their proceeds, and sign contracts beyond their ministries. In theory, autonomy would spark efficiency. In practice, autonomy collided with prices that still lied. If inputs were cheap by decree and outputs subsidized at the checkout, profit became a rationing coupon, not a signal. Directors learned fast. Chase favorable plan assignments, secure your supply, and push losses into the budget. The new freedom mostly changed who they argued with. Meanwhile, Glasnost pulled back curtains. Newspaper stories detailed rusting equipment, fulfilled factories idled for lack of parts, and warehouses stuffed with obsolete inputs. Workers read about gold sales shoring up imports. They read about oil prices dismantling the budget. They read about grain bought with dollars. Then they looked at their kitchens. The contradiction became personal. The rhetoric said restructuring. The refrigerator said rationing. The reforms also opened a door that planners had tried to keep shut: cooperatives. Small private groups were allowed to trade, repair, even manufacture. A few months later, stalls appeared stacked with goods the state couldn't supply: spare parts, jeans, sausages, electronics. Prices were shocking because they were real. Wages, frozen in a world of fictitious prices, couldn't stretch. The state called it speculation. Shoppers called it survival. The black market came into the sun and made the gap visible. What things actually cost versus what the plan said they should. What nobody knew at the time was how deeply the old system fought back inside the reforms. Ministries kept control over key inputs: steel, energy, transport, so enterprise autonomy meant little when a director still needed a phone call to get a rail car. Gosplan's grip loosened, but no market replaced it. Managers were told to negotiate. They didn't have customers, only counterparties chasing their own quotas. Contracts proliferated, bottlenecks multiplied. It felt like freedom on paper and logjams in practice. There was a political clock ticking. Defense had constituencies, factories, cities, design bureaus tied to secure budgets. Cutting there required a strategy and a substitute. The leadership tried to squeeze around the edges, redirecting some machine building to civilian lines. But retooling costs money, and money was short. Oil receipts were down, gold was being sold, foreign creditors were cautious. The arsenal stayed funded, housing repairs didn't. Then came a gesture meant to build trust, revealing the truth about the books. Budget deficits were acknowledged, soft loans to loss-making enterprises were flagged, subsidies that kept bread cheap were costed in rubles. The public learned the state had been concealing a hole for years. It wasn't treason, it was math catching up. But trust is fragile. You can tell people the truth and lose them if the truth is that you can't deliver. On a factory floor in Sverdlovsk, a meeting ran past midnight. The director laid out the new rules. The plant could choose its suppliers, set bonuses, sign long-term contracts. A machinist raised his hand. With what? The bearings they needed came from a mill that now demanded cash, not quotas. The bank could issue credit, but rubles didn't buy the imported steel grade they required. The director nodded. We'll barter. Within weeks, barter chains emerged. Lathes for fuel oil, tires for grain, refrigerators for copper. It kept lines moving and undercut the very price system reformers were trying to build. While that was happening in Moscow, across the Union, republics tested sovereignty. If the center couldn't supply, they would keep more of what they produced. Inter-republic deliveries faltered. A textile plant in Lithuania lost cotton from Central Asia. A steel mill in Ukraine waited on coking coal from Kuzbas. The plan had been a web. Reforms turned it into a tug-of-war over threads. The timing was brutal. Just as the country needed coordination, the old command lost legitimacy and the new market hadn't formed. Gorbachev's circle split. One camp wanted deeper shock, free prices, hard budgets, convertible ruble. Another urged caution, pilot programs, gradualism, hold the line on staples. They compromised and got the worst of both. Enterprises faced sharper edges without real markets. Consumers saw prices rise unofficially while official prices held, creating shortages twice over. Money chased goods that didn't exist, queues lengthened, patience thinned. What nobody could say plainly from the podium was simple. The system had been subsidizing itself with oil, secrecy, and statistics. When Glasnost turned on the lights and oil turned off the cash, Perestroika exposed the wiring. The country saw the gap between slogans and shelves. The engineers understood it as a control problem without feedback. The accountants understood it as a balance sheet without cash flow. The public understood it as a promise broken at the bakery, the bus stop, the pharmacy counter. Perestroika was supposed to fix the machine. Glasnost showed that the machine had been running on borrowed time. By the end of the decade, the reforms hadn't failed because people didn't want change. They failed because change needed prices, property, and patience, and the state's ledger couldn't pay for any of them. Hard currency crisis. Dollars become existential. The moment oil collapsed, dollars turned from convenience to oxygen. The ruble ran the home front, but only hard currency bought the things that kept the machine from seizing. Grain, bearings, turbines, precision lathes, chemicals, spare parts for Western rigs already sunk into Siberian mud. Inside Bank, clerks watched a simple ratio ruin plans. Each barrel exported now fetched half the dollars, while contracts written in better times still demanded payment in full. The question changed from, what should we import? To, what must we import to avoid system failure this quarter? Priority lists hardened. Food first. Grain shipments were scheduled like troop movements. Next came the industrial lifelines, process catalysts for refineries, specialty steels, microelectronics batches promised under long-standing deals. Consumer imports fell last in line and often off the list entirely. The public experienced it as empty shelves. The bank tallied it as arrears avoided. To bridge gaps, the state bank sold gold more aggressively. What had been a seasonal valve became a monthly ritual. Bullion out, dollars in, cables flashed to Hamburg, Montreal, Chicago. Each sale carried a signal. Reserves are not a symbol, they are collateral. Creditors read it. European banks that had extended trade credits on oil's reputation began trimming exposure. Tenors shortened, margins crept, and documentation turned fussy. A shipment that once moved on a government guarantee now needed additional assurances. Some lines were rolled with a quiet warning, others were left to mature. It wasn't panic yet, but the tide was going out, and the USSR's swimsuits were the memos the public never saw. arrears on machinery purchases, rescheduled grain payments, disputed quality claims deployed as bargaining chips to buy time. Meanwhile, hidden inflation at home turned into open pressure on the foreign account. Official prices didn't move, but shortages did. Cooperatives sold at market rates, wages chased scarcity, and ruble liquidity sloshed into any channel that could turn paper into goods. Directors with new autonomy used rubles to hoard inputs. Rubles couldn't cross borders, so the country's true scarcity, dollars, worsened. Barter chains multiplied domestically. Externally, they were useless. A refrigerator could pay for diesel within the Union. It couldn't pay for Canadian wheat. Energy exports offered one stabilizer: gas. Long-term take-or-pay contracts with Europe held better than spot oil. Dollars from gas flowed more predictably, but they didn't cover the whole. Worse, maintaining gas flows required compressor parts and maintenance that increasingly depended on Western suppliers, more dollar outlays to earn dollars. Every hard currency inflow carried a built-in claim on the next outflow. The balance of payments ledger read like a short story with a twist you could see coming and still not avoid. Inside ministries, triage turned granular. A chemical complex in Dzerzhinsk needed imported catalysts to run a reformer that fed aviation fuel output. Without them, aviation fuel fell, squeezing civilian airlines and military training schedules. The catalyst purchase moved to the top of the dollar list, ahead of a machine tool order that would have modernized a plant's line 2 years from now. Investment bowed to upkeep, tomorrow's sacrifice to today. The cumulative effect was fatal. Replacement of obsolete equipment slipped another year, then another, ensuring that next year's dollar needs would be larger for the same output. What nobody acknowledged in speeches was that the hard currency crisis exposed the false comfort of the Union's size. 15 republics traded millions of tons of goods internally at planned prices, but none of it settled a single foreign invoice. When republics asserted economic sovereignty, they often withheld deliveries to the center to protect local needs. The center, in turn, had fewer goods to barter for friendly currency or to export for hard currency. The internal web frayed just as the external lifeline thinned. A Minsk electronics factory that once shipped components to Moscow for assembly now demanded cash. Moscow had rubles, the global market wanted dollars. The defense burden, long hidden in euphemisms, became an arithmetic wall. Cutting procurement could free rubles. It didn't free dollars already committed to specialized imports feeding military plants, nor could it be done quickly without idling entire cities. So the burden shifted elsewhere, to civilian imports, to maintenance, to quality. Ships queued longer for spare parts. Aircraft cannibalized less critical fleets. Railroads stretched inspection intervals. Each temporary measure bought a quarter and sold a year. Then came the quiet humiliations. Delegations went to Western capitals to negotiate rescheduling. State entities offered offtake swaps, future oil for present credit gas volumes as surety for machine deliveries. It worked sometimes, but every deal tightened constraints, securitizing the future at discount. The accountants saw it for what it was: asset sales in disguise. Gold bars, forward barrels, guaranteed gas flows. The cupboard inventory shrank. On the street, the crisis wore simpler clothes. Pharmacies posted handwritten signs: no antibiotics, no insulin today. A port crane broke. The replacement gear sourced from abroad was delayed by payments. A bakery shortened hours because the imported enzyme that stabilized flour wasn't delivered. People didn't talk about Vinesh Econombank. They talked about their kids' shoes. By 1989, the narratives crossed. Political sovereignty movements rose as the center failed to supply. Economic sovereignty asserted itself because the center couldn't pay. The hard currency crisis wasn't a headline. It was a daily ration of absence, and by then, everyone inside those ledgers understood the core truth. Dollars had become existential because they priced something the plan never could: time. The Union was running out of it. Republic revolt. Fiscal federalism unravels. While the dollar crisis squeezed from the outside, something inside the Union began to split along its seams. Money that used to flow downhill to Moscow started getting dammed at the source. The republics, long treated as administrative units in a single plan, began acting like fiscal sovereigns. To understand why, follow a tax ruble from a factory floor in Ukraine. For decades, enterprise profits and turnover taxes rose to the Union budget, then trickled back through ministries as subsidies, investments, and wage funds. It worked as long as the center could supply fuel, parts, and food on time. By the late 1980s, the center's deliveries faltered. In response, Republican leaders asked a simple question: Why send money up if nothing comes back? The first move was legal. Republics passed sovereignty declarations asserting the primacy of republican law over union directives in economic matters. On paper, it sounded abstract. In practice, it meant tax payments were rerouted. A Lithuanian plant paid into a republican account first, then negotiated with Moscow. A Georgian refinery earmarked excise receipts to the republican budget before sharing the leftover. The center called it illegal withholding. The republics called it self-defense. Meanwhile, ministries in Moscow discovered they couldn't compel shipments the way they once had. A Latvian port authority owed hard currency reimbursements for servicing foreign ships, held back transfers until arrears were cleared. A Kazakh coal combine, starved of equipment, delivered to nearby power stations under bilateral deals with the Republican government rather than fulfill union contracts. The web of planned deliveries, frayed as local leaders, chose certainty at home over obligations to a cashless center. What nobody outside the budget meetings knew was how arithmetic drove politics. The union budget had three anchors: defense, subsidies on staples, and transfers to poorer republics. Defense couldn't be cut quickly. Bread subsidies were politically untouchable. Equalization payments bought peace at the periphery. When oil collapsed and tax inflows thinned, the only lever left was discipline. But discipline needs enforcement and goods to trade. Moscow had less of both. Republics recognized leverage. Russia itself, by far the largest republic, asserted economic sovereignty in 1990, declaring that union laws applied only if they didn't contradict Russian laws. When the core refuses to prioritize the center, everyone else follows. Ukraine demanded a greater share of export earnings from steel and agriculture. Azerbaijan moved to keep more oil revenue at home. Uzbekistan insisted cotton proceeds cover local needs first. Each assertion tightened the noose on the union's cash flow. There were micro-moments that made the shift permanent. At a budget conference, a Belarusian finance official presented a ledger showing delayed transfers from Moscow stretching months. "We'll fund pensions locally until arrears clear," he said. The room didn't argue, they took notes. In Yerevan, the Republican government authorized enterprises to settle inter-public trade in goods rather than rubles. Barter replaced budget transfers because rubles didn't move steel or wheat anymore. While that was happening in Kiev, miners in Donbass went on strike. They didn't just demand soap and boots, they demanded the right for their wages to come from enterprise accounts under Republican control. Strikes spread into a political program, decentralize finances, let enterprises negotiate directly, keep proceeds local. The center sent envoys with promises. The miners sent them back with lists of arrears and broken deliveries. The republics read the mood and legislated to match it. Fiscal federalism turned inside out. Instead of a union collecting and redistributing, the republics collected and rationed, and the center came cap in hand. Gosbank branches took instructions from Republican authorities to prioritize local payments. Taxes once earmarked for Moscow were earmarked for schools, hospitals, power plants inside the republic. The central treasury's cash pool shrank to a puddle. Budget drafts became fiction the moment they were printed. Unknown to many, this revolt reached the border agencies. Customs, once a union function, fell under Republican influence. Ukraine began introducing export controls to prevent its goods from leaving without local approval. Lithuania, asserting independence, set up checkpoints that slowed inter-public trade. Trucks idled as paperwork proliferated. Factories missed inputs because one republic's new rules delayed another's shipment. It looked like bureaucracy. It was sovereignty asserting itself through stamps and seals. The impact on the hard currency crisis was immediate. Export volumes declined as inter-republic wrangling delayed cargoes. Revenues from union-controlled sales were siphoned by Republican entities that now claimed a share or the whole. Moscow's ability to pledge future exports for credit weakened because it couldn't guarantee control over the goods. Creditors noticed. Negotiations stalled on a question that had never arisen. Who exactly speaks for the union's revenues? There was dramatic irony in the numbers. The union had created a system of transfers to hold the periphery. When the center lost liquidity, the periphery replicated those transfers inward, creating local safety nets while starving the core. A Moldovan finance minister said it plainly behind closed doors. "We are doing at our level what Moscow did at its level, only we can still pay." It wasn't defiance for its own sake, it was arithmetic triage. In the Kremlin, the choice sharpened. Reassert control and risk open confrontation, or concede and shrink de facto before dissolving de jure. Gorbachev pushed a new union treaty to rebalance powers and revenues to keep a common currency and defense with greater Republican autonomy. On paper, it was a compromise. In reality, the fiscal base that could sustain even a looser union was eroding daily. Each week, more taxes stayed local, more contracts went bilateral, more budgets ignored Moscow. By the time signatures were scheduled, the money had already voted. The union's fiscal heart had stopped beating in Moscow and restarted, weekly and separately, in 15 chests. The accountants didn't need a referendum to know what came next. Hidden inflation goes visible. The price explosion. There'd been inflation for years, only it didn't look like numbers on a price tag. It looked like a line that never moved and a shelf that stayed empty. Economists called it repressed inflation, too much money chasing goods that weren't there, with the pressure bottled up as cues, ration books, favors, and bribes. Under Glasnost, the bottle cracked. Directors had more autonomy, wages drifted up through bonuses and side payments, cooperatives charged what the market would bear, and the rubles the state had printed to keep plants calm now had fewer goods to buy. The pressure finally found an exit: prices. The first signal was subtle and terrifying. Official prices held, but shops began quietly limiting quantities. Clerks kept lists under the counter for regulars. Everyone else met an empty rack. On paper, the state saw stable prices. In kitchens, people tracked inflation as hours lost in line, packets of coffee at twice the real price through a cousin, a coat that couldn't be had for any price unless you knew the warehouse guard. Hidden inflation wore work boots, not a decimal point. Then the co-ops arrived. Legalized small enterprises sold sausage, shoes, and spare parts openly at market rates. It was a miracle and an insult. For the first time, you could buy what you needed without begging, but you'd pay 5-10 times the official price. The wage a factory paid in rubles met a street that priced in scarcity. People called it speculation. Economists called it dual pricing. The lived reality was a two-tiered country. The plan world, where money claimed to be worth something, and the market world, where money discovered what it was. Inside the ministries, the numbers went red. Budget subsidies for staples, bread, milk, transport ballooned because procurement costs rose while shop prices didn't. Every ruble the state spent to hold down the bread price poured more rubles into a system without goods to match. Enterprises begged for higher wholesale prices to cover rising input costs. The state agreed case by case, prying open the lid a little more. Wages chased those costs. The loop tightened. Meanwhile, a quiet shift in pay revealed the breakdown. Work brigades demanded bonuses paid in kind, boots, fuel coupons, food parcels, because rubles were losing meaning. Factory directors hoarded marketable goods for payroll that starved shops and fed resentment. A rail yard superintendent negotiated to settle a transport debt in refrigerators instead of money. Within days, those fridges showed up at a co-op stall at a price that made a month's salary look small. Cash became a claim, only if you could convert it into stuff quickly. What nobody knew at the time was how close the state came to admitting defeat on paper. Drafts for price reform circulated with tables showing the true cost of staples and the nightmare of letting prices jump to meet it. One version pointed to a 2- to 3-fold rise needed to balance supply and demand. Another, more honest, pointed higher. The political choice was grim: cold turkey liberalization with a burst of visible pain, or continued bottling of inflation that rotted trust. They chose half measures. The market leaked through every hole. Then came the moment people remember as a feeling more than a date. A regional party boss went on television and asked citizens not to panic. Flour deliveries were on the way. The next morning, there was a run on anything that could be stored: sugar, cereals, canned meat. In some cities, administrations introduced ration cards for basics. In others, they printed coupons for soap, detergent, cigarettes. The line shifted from the bakery to the distribution office. The bureaucracy built to suppress prices now built a second economy to track scarcity. It didn't restore confidence. It told everyone the center had lost the map. And across town, something else happened. The co-op opened a small shop selling imported washing powder and chocolate. The line formed before dawn, not because prices were low, but because product existed.